All right, let's get discussing chords. Three-note chords can also often be referred to as triads, and they are harmonious. You could consider chords to be part of the harmony family. An example of a chord might sound something like this. This would be a C major chord. And what you'll notice is that we've taken these three notes from our C major pentascale, the first, third, and fifth note from that scale. I want to take a brief moment to outline the distance between the bottom to the top note. You'll notice if we count up through semitones, we have, starting on C, up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 semitones. So the bottom note of a major chord or a minor chord, as we'll find out, is 7 semitones. Bottom to top, 7 semitones. So there's no perfect middle ground. Just like in life, it's very hard to be in an absolutely neutral state. So there's no absolute middle note between these bottom and top notes of our chord. So there's always some sort of lean towards a more low sound or a higher up sound, a dark sound or a brighter sound, or referred to as a minor sound and a major sound. So if we go from the bottom note up 4 semitones, 1, 2, 3, 4, a little bit above that middle point, and then an additional 3 semitones to get up to that distance, bottom to top, 7 semitones, we have a major chord, and this middle note is a little bit above that perfect middle point that doesn't exist. It's a little bit uplifted. Whereas if I was to take that middle note and lower it a little bit, so from our bottom we're only up 3 semitones, and then an additional 4 to get to the top, now that middle note is slightly below this imaginary middle point. I say imaginary middle point because there's no 3.5 semitones between these 7 semitones, bottom to top, of our chord. So I want you to think of major and minor as a little bit uplifted for major, a little bit lowered for minor. Now we're not thinking major is sharp, minor is flat, but it's just interesting that if you think of this floating middle point as a neutral mood and raising a little above it is a little bit happy or uplifted, and lowering a little bit below it is a little bit dark or sort of put down, that really reflects well with the idea of the tonality and the emotion behind major and minor chords. So when we put it together, our major chord sounds like, and our minor chord sounds like. Do you feel it? Do you feel the uplifting, happy feeling of the major chord and the more dark, sad, sort of spooky sound of the minor chord? It's there, and sometimes it takes a little while before we're able to hear that. Now, I mentioned that we can take this middle point and think a little above or a little bit below, and that helps us see how the mood is shifted. But again, you can also just think of major scales, minor scales, in this case our pentascales, which is all we really need for now. And think of the odd numbers, so 1, 3, and 5 from our major pentascale gives you a major chord, whereas 1, 3, and 5 from our minor pentascale gives you a minor chord. This is also true for when we go into full major scales and full minor scales, because we only need the first, third, and fifth note to create these chords or triads. So we could add a fourth note up on the octave once we have our full scale, but it's not necessary. It doesn't change the sound of the chord at all. It might thicken it up a little bit, but it's no different than adding a little bit more flour to gravy. It doesn't really taste any different, it's just a bit thicker. Same with the minor chord, we can have a 4-note version once we get into full scales, but we're not too concerned with that for now. So because we have these 3 notes from our pentascale that are so important to create this major chord, they end up acting sort of like tonal pillars, by which I mean sort of magnets that attract the other notes. That's mostly true in this case when I'm playing a C major chord, and in my other hand, let's say, I'm playing one of those 5 notes. C will sound very stable against my C major chord. D is going to feel like it wants to move somewhere, but it could be comfortable as a sort of colorful finish if we need to. E, or mi in this case, so we have do, re, mi, is going to be a little bit more uplifting, a little bit more happy. After all, it is the sound that makes our major chord sound major, but it still sounds relatively resolved as well. We could continue on to fa, a very tense sound against our major chord, most specifically because of the relationship between this mi from our chord, and fa clashing as a displaced semitone, a semitone that has been moved up an octave. And so is a finished feeling, but maybe the least finished. It kind of wants to move back to do, but it could stay there. It's a bit of a sort of question mark, yet resolved sort of finish. So we can relate our solfege syllables to this chord. Now, that's not always going to be the case in the real world of music. You're not always going to be playing the one chord. In other words, the chord that starts on do. In this case, C major. You might be playing some other chords that are available from whatever scale your song is in, or whatever key your song is in. So you can still kind of think of the relationship between melody and chord in the same way, that your melody is going to sound more settled when it's playing a note that your chord is playing. It's going to sound less settled, less resolved, more dissonant when it's playing one of the notes that is not in your current chord. For these courses, we're just going to be talking about using the one chord as our reference point. Again, the chord that starts on do, and hearing how everything relates to that chord. This will later open up Pandora's box so that as you're navigating between different chords, you're going to be able to hear the relationship between your melody and that harmony. Another thing worth mentioning is that in this class, I don't say sol, I'll say so. It's sort of an American adaptation. Sol can be quite clunky. It would be the only solfege syllable that finishes in a consonant, and it just doesn't flow as well, in my opinion. So I'll be using so within these classes, so just be ready for that. So that is a breakdown of major chords or triads, minor chords or triads, and how they relate to our pentascales, picking the first, third, and fifth note from either our major pentascale or our minor pentascale. So that's a brief overview of those major chords and minor chords. In your next class, I'll be playing a succession of these chords, and you're going to have to try to identify the quality. Is it a major chord? Is it a minor chord? And every course, we're going to be adding more chords to keep you on your toes. I'll see you in the next class.